How's it going, everybody? We did this for about Opus 16, where I went through and I made a meta report where I talked about all the top decks and what I expected to see, and it went over really well. People seemed to really enjoy it. So I thought, with maybe the biggest tournament entrance-wise since 2020, it would be kind of nice to go over, see where the current meta is at least in my opinion, talk about some of the decks a bit, and go from there. So it's going to be a little bit freeform. We'll have a tier list a little bit into the video, but there's going to be a 120 plus player tournament on Octagon, which is a free simulator for Final Fantasy TCG, and I'll be streaming my matches on twitch.tv/ghoul02. So if you wanted to go check that out, hang out for a little bit, at least until I end up dropping or whatever ends up happening, I would be happy to see y'all there. Alright, so let's go ahead and without further ado, let's get right into it. So these are my tier list definitions. This isn't like a stricter like Yu-Gi-Oh tier list thing. I'm not like putting arbitrary barriers on what decks are what. So these are my definitions for the different tiers. Tier 1s are decks that I think, if they're piloted by a good player, will be among the favorites to win any large event. I think Tier 2, our decks are going to take about 20 to 50% of top cut, but for one reason or another, you'll see less representation from them in top players and top tables. This to me can actually be because a deck is harder to pilot or harder to construct. I think there's a lot of reasons that a Tier 1 deck is expected to be there, but I do think Tier 2 is more than capable of winning a large event. Tier 3, this is, I expect to see a deck from Tier 3 sneak into top 16 or top 8 of a large event. I just don't expect it very often. I think they need a bit of luck on matchups. And then Rogue is a deck that I think if you're unprepared, you will lose to. But I think they're going to struggle to have game to make it into the top cut of a large tournament at the moment. So, tier list. There it is. You guys can exit the video now because I'm sure this is what half of y'all are here for. These are my expectations. They're not necessarily in order. Tier 1 is sort of ordered for me. So let's go deck by deck. So Tier 1, I have Storm, and this includes Icewind and Earthwind. I think all of them have very valid game at the moment for different reasons. Avalanche, I think, is the second best deck of the format, in part because of a favorable Storm matchup. Storm is kind of the big boss, gatekeeper, literal Stormcloud hanging over the rest of the format. Every single deck either has to have a plan to beat Storm, or they will lose to Storm. And there's going to hint, there's a lot of the latter going on. I think Twin's the third best deck of the format. I think they are the best anti-bullshit deck, which I think is actually very valuable in an event this large. Being able to have a deck that is very counter when your opponent's trying to do something strange tends to be very good. It's why generic hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh, for instance, are so powerful. Something like an Infinite Impermanence or an Ash Blossom. If you don't know what your opponent's going to play, they do a good job of catching all the like little small in-between scenarios. That's what Twins does probably better than any deck in the game. It does well against just about everything. Soiree, I think, is the fourth best deck. I'm a little iffy because I don't see how this deck is as good consistently as it is. But it is always very well represented. There are lots of good pilots that will always play Soiree. And for that reason, I think it's very clearly a Tier 1 deck, although I do think that it's starting to reach kind of the peak of its power ceiling a little bit. Earth Lightning, I think, is just below Soiree. I think this has a good matchup against a lot of other decks. It does a good job of gatekeeping, but it has a very bad Storm matchup especially. And lastly, I think the deck that came from out of nowhere that I did not expect to be this good is Yuffie Turbo. I'll get into more of that a little bit later. This is probably like one of the big new contenders to top, or the top decks after the new Opus. For Tier 2, these are not in any particular order. This is not perfect, but Ice Earth, Mono Water variant / Folka, Retainers, Rydia, Ice Lightning, Samurais, Monofire, good stuff. Ninjas, Turbo Discard, Sky Pirates, and Kingslave, I think all have various levels of game. It's definitely not ordered. I think that I would personally put Rydia, Ice Earth, Sky Pirates, and Samurais kind of above everything else. And then like there's like a mini tier after that for ninjas, and then everything else kind of falls below that. But I think there are like good reasons to suspect those decks will do well. Tier 3, we got a bunch of archetypal decks. These are actually pretty much ordered, I think, by how strong they're expected to be. Dragoons, Monks, Knights, Dancers. And then in Rogue, I've got a couple of other like little mini archetypes I think are worth mentioning. But we'll get to those when we get there. So for anybody that doesn't know, I think the top of the metagame is going to be a bit of a triangle meta. Just imagine Yuffie's kind of hanging off to the side over here, because Yuffie just kind of does her own thing, and your deck either has an answer to her or it doesn't. Storm beats any fair deck, but especially Earth Lightning is going to really struggle with Storm. Earth Lightning is going to have a good matchup into Avalanche, which is going to have a good matchup into any kind of Wind Storm variant. And then kind of in the middle, you have Twins and Soiree doing their own thing. I forgot to put Yuffie on this slide. That said, I think there's a very clear top dog in Storm. That said, I don't know that Storm will win because, again, everybody's going to be so anticipating it. So Storm, there are four variants of Storm worth considering at the moment. There's Mono Wind, which is going to be the most prevalent. I think it's the easiest to pilot. It's probably the strongest as well. There are reasons to go with the other ones, but the Mono Wind deck is effectively an aggro combo deck. And I don't mean aggro as in I'm going to jam out a bunch of monsters, but effectively the deck kind of does its own thing until it gets to the point where nothing your opponent does anymore matters. And it tries to get there as fast as possible, which it does thanks to the fact that you're not color fixing, you're not trying to like do anything, you are just trying to get 5 backups, Rosa, Atomos on field as quickly as possible, at which point the game is over. I think we'll see a lot more Icewind this set as well. Icewind trades the sheer speed of Monowind, although it still retains a lot of it. But it trades that for a lot of anti-aggression tools, which is very valuable. The one weakness that Storm tends to have is that it's a setup deck. It wants to get its 4 or 5 backups out before it really starts popping off. And Icewind is a deck that sometimes can generate the time to do that through dull freezing characters and discarding and lock being crazy. I think Earthwind made a big resurgence towards the end of last set as well, especially in Japan. Effectively, what Earthwind does differently, there's 2 main things. Number 1 is Earthwind has access to all the Earth board wipes, so Shantoto, Titan, Shadowlord. It handles aggression much better than traditional Storm. What Earthwind also has is searchability. So Monowind and Icewind will index very heavily into draw power to get to their cards. Earthwind Storm can kind of search their stuff out, although it's a little bit higher cost. Lastly, the other thing it has is it has the retainer package. You can run 3 Noctis, 3 Prompto, 2 Gladio, and an Ignis. And you kind of have this like all-encompassing removal package to pair along with the backbone that Storm has that gives it late game against any deck in the game. And then lastly, there's Tilica Loop, which it's a deck that goes infinite and banishes every card in your opponent's deck. Not too much more to say. Essentially, it abuses Tilica better than the card designers intended, although I don't know what they intended with Tilica, because what a disaster of a card design that was. Second best deck, Avalanche. There's a couple of different ways to build it, but this deck got effectively 2 of the best cards I could have ever asked for in Billy Bob and Polk. I think both are massive, massive buffs to Avalanche Operative. I think the ability to go now Elfie into Polk and have 2 colors fixed for your Barret is ludicrous. I think the deck now has kind of infinite recursion on top of the speed it had before, which is just a really scary combination, all things considered. This deck can so easily get 7 forwards out and be punching you in, drawing to 8 cards in hand. I've literally played against someone on Avalanche one time. They got, I think, 6 draws slash searches in one battle phase. They like played a backup, or played a Tyro and a Terra, and they still had to discard a card to hand size at the end of the turn. If this deck goes off, it goes off very, very hard. Twins. Twins are, especially Fire Water Twins, they're what I call the anti-bullshit deck. So any deck that is trying to do something unfair or weird or strange, Twins probably has an answer to. And there are decks that, like, if you slam Palamporum turn 1 and they live a turn, the game is effectively over from that point. It's so hard to answer them. They get so big so quickly, and they just tag team kill literally everything. Maybe 2 of the strongest legends of all time when paired together. And I think the Firion and the Arciela, and especially Yuzuki, I think actually had a really big bump in usability this set. That card got very good very quickly. But I think all of those in combination as well are making this into a really, really formidable deck. And I think it just ends up kind of pushing it over the top. I think Firion especially is so powerful. Soiree. So I mentioned it before. I don't really know how Soiree is still winning to the degree that it is. But the fact that it is means that it's a deck that you have to respect. This deck can be built literally any way you want to, as long as you have 3 Edel, 3 Amber, 3 Shinju. I've seen Water, Earth. I've seen Wind, Lightning. I've seen Wind, Earth. You can just do anything, and as long as you have enough of the right cards in your deck, it'll somehow work out for you. I don't really understand how sometimes. But yeah, it's still good. It's still very good. It has the ability to kind of go aggro against Wind, but also has a very strong control element as well, if needed, to kind of handle the aggression that other decks put off. Just a very solid, well-rounded deck that plays. It never feels like it has like super positive matchups. Like there's no like auto win matchups, but there's no auto losses either. It just has game against everything. So the big surprise out of last set was this Earth Lightning deck, where you'd kind of go Man in Black and X Death as like the big additions to like a relatively Earth heavy core. You could also go for like Waltzes and all kinds of stuff like that. I think the Vanille this set is maybe the biggest buff that deck could have ever asked for, as long as it can find a way to get her into play, whether that's Delusory Warlock into Lady of Antiquity and then play Vanille on the next turn, or I really like Reeve turn 1, revive Vanille. But if you get this card out early enough against decks, it legitimately will take over the game unless you're against Mono Fire. And she gets Brynhildred or something. But even then, she has to get Brynhildred on the spot, or you're still probably going to profit off of the card. Just so good and so disruptive. One of the coolest cards of the set. Lastly, the deck that I did not see coming is Yuffie Turbo. So what I did not realize with this card is I thought that Yuffie effectively was a 10k Brave Untargetable. That is not what Yuffie is. Yuffie is a 10k Brave Untargetable instant speed board wipe. So you'll see Yuffie Turbo decks will run anywhere from 8 to as many as 15 Yuffies. And you kind of will jam out Yuffie with some backups to Protector. I've seen this run in Earth for Mistdragon. I've seen it run in Fire for Amaterasu. I've seen it run in Mono Winds. You can like use her to reactivate a fat Chocobo and go off from there. But effectively, Doom of the Living is impossible to resist. 24k every single turn. And you can build a deck in a way so that you can fire that effectively every single turn with Azura, Yuffie, as long as you get to the first copy of her. I do think the one thing about Yuffie Turbo that makes me hesitant, makes me think it might actually be tier 2, is that a lot of the variants tend to be more linear. They have to kind of splash a sub-engine in order to fully close out games. It reminds me a lot of Folka, back when Folka was good. I think Yuffie's a much harder card to out than Folka was at times, given that just how much bigger Yuffie is and how much more of a threat she poses by herself. But I think that it's kind of lacking in the natural bomb that like traditional Folka had in Mashuri. So Alright, so tier 2, this is no particular order. Ice Earth is still really good. The only thing is that because a lot of decks are planning to go fast to beat Storm, this deck can kind of struggle against that, but it's effectively kind of trying to. Sometimes it tries to use the format's aggression against itself. Earth is very good at, staying alive, don't die, don't die, don't die. And then you kind of use the ice cards to give you inevitability, thanks to Physalis, Orphan, and Unalaska. So it's kind of just a matter of surviving long enough and safely enough to do that, which it's capable of doing, but it definitely has kind of fallen off as the premier control deck of the format. Mono water variants. They pushed mono water more than any other this set. They gave it Lena and Ash. And they're both good cards. I think my biggest issue is I do not see these having game against Storm. Ash is this really, really powerful card, but she still wants you to get to 5 backups. And if you can get to 5 backups, your wind opponent's getting to 5 backups as well, and you will lose to a wind opponent with 5 backups in water. I do think that the cards are powerful enough that maybe it can adapt, but they are kind of locked into water. And Folka is still good, Folka's still around, but I think the problem with Folka is that it's the same issue Folka's always had, which is that against the decks it's good against, it will auto-win on the spot, and then against the decks it's bad against, aka Storm, it just has no way of making up the deficit. And I really think that especially like top players, one of the reasons that Earth is so common among top decks, Earth gives you that flexibility as a top player to kind of flex your own skills to win games. And I don't know that Mono Water gives top players the ability to do that. So I don't know how many of the best players in the room will be on Mono Water to begin with, is the other kind of weird question mark about Mono Water in a single deck format. I think there's just one deck that's usually going to speak to someone more, and they're going to feel like there's just more they can do with it. Retainers. So notably, Retainers I think can be an engine in Storm, and that deck is tier 1. But I think the Retainer engine itself is just generally really, really good and works as a standalone package, and you can run it with like a Sophie Wall variant. You can go something like play Sophie, play Noctis, play Wall, and then punch 2 separate things for 10k. It's a bit tricky. And again, you're kind of mid-range in a format that like being mid-range is very scary, but it also can be fast enough to like deal with mono win just based on how many of the cards can become very cheap. Rydia Turbo is maybe the weirdest deck on this list because Rydia Turbo, when it wins, looks incredible. Like, this is one of the most ridiculous cards they've ever printed. She's very difficult to deal with, very difficult to remove unless you're on a lightning deck that happens to be running exactly Ixion. But the thing that's always blown my mind about Rydia is the only aggro control deck. It'll play off of 2 backups just fine for most of the game. It can be very aggressive. You can do a lot of damage very quickly. But it scales. And it scales very, very powerfully. Turns out that Sophie, as a late game win con, is very difficult for opponents to deal with. And Rydia herself does not get worse over the course of the game. In fact, she gets almost better as you get more. You kind of go like minus to set up your Rydia, so if she lives, you start accumulating hand size and summons in hand, and she just kind of ends up taking over the game. So it's like an aggro control deck where you're like constantly playing on both players' turns, and you're doing things all the time. Just very, very good deck and very good card. This is one that I think people may argue with me to put in tier 1. I don't have Ice Lightning being that much better than it was, and that's not me saying that I don't think Ice Lightning is good. I think that I had Ice Lightning as being better than everyone else prior to this set, and Sephiroth is a very, very good card. But fundamentally, I think Ice Lightning still does similar things to what it's always done. It just got a couple of extra tools to get there. I think solving this is also difficult. I was a big fan of the Nox Suzaku list that a friend of mine made back in Opus 16. I genuinely think that that deck was tier 2 if people caught on to it. I think the main reason it didn't was never winning an event and kind of causing people to realize how good the deck was. I haven't found a version of that deck that I like for the current set, but I don't think that rules out Ice Lightning as a deck overall. I think a lot of the cards are still individually very powerful. It's just a matter of figuring out the kind of the last, I would say, 20 cards of your deck, and Ice Lightning is very difficult. Samurais. Samurais are about as good as they've been ever since Tenzin was released. I think Opus 12's fire cards may go down as kind of one of the best sets of cards in history when you factor in Tenzin and Amaterasu. Not much to say about Samurais hasn't been said. It's very quick. Tenzin is like its pseudo 2CP forward if you discard a Samurai and hit on your first turn. And he only gets better from there. Cyan is still good enough to show up in fire decks on his own. He's still better than his counterpart in Yugiri. They're just big, hit hard, and they're a good shell for Amaterasu, which basically is good enough to power decks by itself. Mono fire, good stuff. You don't want to play the Samurai engine. It's probably a little worse, but not that much worse. So, yeah. Ninjas, Final Fantasy IV, I think this is kind of like this mono wind hybrid deck that plays like the Light Cecil and Theodore and all of these category 4 characters, along with the fact that like there's a really good critical mass of ninjas in category 4. And the one thing that this deck has over every other deck is backup destruction. There are a lot of ninjas that attack backups, which like low cost backups, which is something the game just doesn't do basically ever. I think that's kind of what sets it apart. It kind of forms this like mid-range deck that can be very powerful in the right circumstances. Turbo Discard got a big buff this set with Theodore. I hate this card. I think it's pretty poorly designed. The fact that I think both players complain about Theodore existing probably tells you all that you need to know about how well designed this card is. I've heard my friend that plays this card complain that Theodore never actually makes your opponent discard cards, and I will tell you that playing under Theodore is one of the least fun things in history when he gets warped turn 1. We're probably both correct on that. This card simultaneously will rarely make your opponent discard cards, but also your opponent's forced to play around him in a way that's very unfun. I think a card that both players don't enjoy playing is not a well-designed card. Shocker. But he does everything that Turbo Discard kind of would have wanted. The way to kind of, if you never played against Turbo Discard, and I played against Turbo Discard a lot, what you end up doing against the deck is you kind of curve out backups, try to like get to the point where you feel you can go all in. Because you essentially you want to keep the Physalis dead for as long as possible, while also like there's like a judgment call to it, because it's like when you go to no cards in hand, they stop getting pluses off of your discards, but then Physalis becomes the best card in the game. So you have to like make this judgment call on when to go all in against these discard decks. And Theodore takes the guesswork out of it. Theodore just says, you're going all in on this turn, and you better hope that you're going to top deck out of it, which it's just very unfun. I don't like this card. I wish it wasn't printed, but it is enough to make Turbo Discard probably good enough to see tournament success. Lastly, we have Sky Pirates. Having played this deck, this might be too low. This might actually be tier 1 and just be hard to pilot and build. I think the couple issues with Sky Pirates, there's so much space now that's kind of dedicated to specific cards thanks to Fran, that I think it's a lot harder to adapt to different metas. If there's a specific card or deck you need to target, like say you really expect Yuffie to be a problem, it can be very hard to tech for that with Sky Pirates because of the density of Sky Pirate names you have to play. However, I've gotten to the nut board in Sky Pirates on turn 3 before. and you can play a bunch of EX bursts to get there. And when you do so, your opponent just no longer gets to interact with you. You essentially just build Exodia out of them, and I think that can't be understated. Is it a deck that I think? No, this could be tier 1. It's really, honestly, like, we go back to the tier list. Of the tier 2 decks, probably Sky Pirates, Ninjas, Ice Earth, and Rydia are the best of the set. And I would say that Rydia and the Sky Pirates are a little above Ninjas and Ice Earth. So, Kingsglaive, I almost put this in tier 3, but it always gets tops, like one top every event somehow. I don't know how. Nyx is really, really good, but it still just feels like a deck that feels like it either has to go too all in or isn't fast enough when it doesn't go all in. But it's done well enough that I can't really argue one way or another against it. Alright, tier 3. Dragoons maybe are tier 2-ish, but fun fact, I didn't know this Freya was a common. I thought she was a starter deck card. The fact that this card is a common is genuinely kind of hilarious, considering this is maybe one of the best archetypal boss monsters ever printed. But yeah, Dragoons are still really good. They have kind of weird issues where you're forced to play a lot of Dragoons, which means, again, you can't tech for different metagames. It's still going to have dedicated pilots, and a turn 1 Alice maybe is one of the hardest things to deal with if you don't have access to breaking large backups. Monks, I think, have started to really show a lot of their age. Maybe not even necessarily age, but speed. Monks feel very, very slow. It's one of the only decks that like kind of mandatorily will play the Anthem for the element. They'll play Anacro to try to like make their power a little bit bigger, because they still care about like fighting and combat, and those are just kind of things that have started to fall off, and for good reason. Knights got a big boost this set with Ramza, but I'm kind of I hate saying this because this is maybe my favorite deck in the game, like of all time, just given this was the deck that got me to start playing the game. But Opus 14 Garland has never felt worse to play. To the point where I actually talked Travis into playing the 5 CP Brave giving Garland, because that Garland actually does something off of Ramza. And you're not like forced to play 3 of it. You can play 2 of that Garland and feel okay about the space investment. It's strange because there are decks it's good against, and then there's decks it's going to really struggle with. Agrius cannot deal with cannot kill a Soiree by herself. Finding the incidental ping to pair with it can be hard. You have like very large forwards, but you have like you can struggle to find interaction for your opponent's turn. I think the deck as it stands is good, but not quite there. Lastly, I've got Dancers in tier 3, and this is like the very bottom of tier 3 for me. Lilithset, if she was in Wind or Water, would be regarded as the craziest archetypal boss since Tenzin. Maybe ever, honestly. She just does everything for the deck. You end up with this control deck that you can deny every single attack you want to, and then when you don't want to deny an attack, you can just board wipe your opponent on command, and when you don't want to do that, she can protect herself, and she gives this ability to every one of your dancers effectively. And with Mayakov, she becomes untargetable, so you have this untargetable body that's just impossible to deal with. This deck is so cool, and it's let down by just a lack of good dancers. Effectively, you have Mayakov, Lilithset, the 3 backup water dancers, and then it becomes like, what do you do from there? There's no other dancers in lightning, so then you have to like consider wind, and there are no good wind dancers other than maybe Pinello, the backup. As far as Rogue, I'll kind of touch on each of these real quick. We're getting a little long, but Ishtola is very good, but Scions are going to struggle against unfair decks. They're very good at handling aggression, but very bad against a lot of other things. Turks, they're just a little vulnerable. You have to kind of like stack the 3 different names, and then I think instant speed interaction is going to be very big. They're kind of a rogue hit based on Yuffie, because you have to pack things to deal with Yuffie, and a lot of what deals with Yuffie is going to deal with Turks. Lastly, Golbez, I think you'll see around. But I think the Golbez himself is maybe a little too high investment to consistently go off. And that's it. So once again, if you guys want to check this out tomorrow, there should be multiple streams on Twitch, but you can also follow me at twitch.tv/ghoul02. That's twitch.tv/ghoul02. I'll be live with my games at least until I end up dropping from the tournament. And yeah, wish me luck. I'm still deciding on my own deck to bring. If you're wondering what I would bring, we're gonna go here. Probably either a Earthwind Storm, a Sky Pirates, or a Rydia list. I'm actually leaning towards Rydia personally. But yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, anything that you think I missed, or am I straight up wrong about something, let me know in a nice way, please. Don't, be like a jerk, like, oh my god, you disrespected my favorite deck. Like, that's not my intent. And last time I did one of these, I completely missed Ice Earth. I did not. I said later, like, yeah, this kind of like falls under like the discard stuff that I had, but like it was a new variant of it. Like that could very easily happen here. A lot of these decks have like similar variants that you could squint at, and like maybe one of those takes over, and I wouldn't know. I know that, like, as I mentioned, this mono water, a lot of them will play Leo, the 1-drop Leo from Opus 16, but it's neither here nor there. Thank you all for watching, and hope to see y'all next time.